Hi, and welcome to the Cloud 365 Solution Day. Thank you for joining me, Mark Stokes, where I'm going to talk about building an automated site check-in system for your organisation. I hope you've had a really good day so far. It's been some really good sessions as far as I can tell, so hopefully we can carry on delivering you a lot of value and good quality content. So the situation we're going to look at today is we're going to try and build an automated site check-in application. We're going to use the Power Platform, so Power Apps, Power Automate, Microsoft SharePoint, to deliver a solution that's going to enable something such as a construction company to automatically track what users are on site of their construction sites at any one time. Now, in a lot of cases, this can be difficult because maybe someone pops off site for a cup of tea or to get a sandwich, and we don't actually know. So if there's an accident or a health and safety issue, we need to know exactly who's on site and who isn't. Now, if we rely on humans, we all know humans make human errors, and sometimes people may not just bother for that 10-15 minutes they pop out. But in a life and death situation, it could be pivotal. So we're going to use that situation to build something that can help those out. The first phase of any project is coming up with the idea. So typically, a business owner will have an issue or a problem in the business that they want to find a solution to. In this case, we've identified that sometimes, due to health and safety, people may not be aware of who's on site at any one time. So if, like we said before, if there's an accident, then we need to know exactly who's on site to make sure we can evacuate that site effectively. We're going to use a construction company as an example here. So we've identified a problem and we've identified that we need a solution for it. The first thing we need to do, or the second thing we need to do after identifying the problem, is to come up with some requirements. We need to decide what it is that we want to achieve, what we want to build. Now, when we look at the requirements, it's really important to not think about technology. I know I've already said that we're going to be using the Power Platform to build it. We know that, but to go back through a hypothetical situation, we're going to take a technology agnostic view. And when we build our requirements, we forget about technology. Okay, I see a lot of requirements coming from customers where they're basically reiterating functionality that SharePoint does. There's no point in putting it in there. If you use SharePoint, you get that functionality. Unless you need that in your requirements, don't even write it down. Okay, but if it is a requirement, write it down, but make sure it's written down in a non-technology way. Okay, so we need to remain technology agnostic when we do our requirements. So we're going to keep the application very simple, okay? We're going to have only a couple of requirements points, and we probably would articulate this in a different way. The reason for building requirements is twofold. Typically, you're not going to build the application yourself, okay? More often than not, you're going to get somebody to build the application for you. So we have a communication effort that we need to work on. We need to articulate what it is that we want to achieve with this application, and the person who's going to be building it needs to know what they're supposed to be building so that everyone's on the same page. And that's what the requirements are all about. So the requirements essentially are a tick list of things that it needs to do. Not how it should do it, but what it should do. Okay? So that's my way of telling my developer, this is what I want you to build, and at the end of it, this is what I should be able to do. And the developer knows exactly what's expected of them. There's future phases that go on to talk about how we're going to achieve those requirements, but the key is it should do some things in some way. So we're going to keep our requirements quite simple. The requirements for this application are going to be fourfold. We need to maintain a list of site locations. We're not saying how we need to maintain those locations or where or what technology or what information we need to store about it. We're just saying that we need to maintain a list of site locations. The second point is we need to automatically check a user into a location when they arrive in the vicinity. There's some important, powerful information here, which we'll come on to later. Thirdly, we want to automatically check a user out of a location when they leave the vicinity of that location. And lastly, we want an app to be able to let the user interface with it. That's it. That's our 4 requirement points. Okay? We can tick, 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 tick once they're all completed. So that's what our application should do. Nice and simple. I'm sure there's lots of things it could do. I'm sure we've got lots of ideas of other things we could do. We might want to show it on pretty maps, or we might want to have flashy buttons and things like that. But that's not important now. The core MVP that we have, the minimal viable product that we have here, is those 4 points. That leads me on nicely to talking about an MVP approach. Okay, so when we do projects, we approach it using a minimal viable product approach. When we talk to customers, we like to keep things as simple as possible. The more risk we introduce into an application, the more complexity we put into an. So this moves me nicely onto the MVP approach. We like to take a minimal viable product approach to building solutions and applications. The reason for this is the more complexity that we build into an application, the more risk there is of it failing. So what we try to focus on is what's the minimum set of functionality, what's the minimum amount of work that we need to do for you to have a usable application. We can put lots of bells and whistles on and make it all look pretty, that's fine, but what's the minimum set? What can you not launch that product or that service without being there? If it's going to delay the launch, it's MVP. If you can go live without that there and bring it in at a later date, then it's not part of the MVP. So we like to take an iterative approach and then we can decide what should be there and what shouldn't. And we work in phases after that. So we have a blue sky vision of what the long-term goal is of the application or the product or the service. We know where we want it to go in the long term. But in the short term, we can break that down. What's important to do first? And then what's important to do next? And then what? And then what? And we iterate through that development cycle of it. Now, it's important to think a few iterations or a few cycles ahead because then we're not going to put any blockers in place and things that might make future work difficult. So focusing on what's important and what the blue sky is, absolutely, and then work on each phase and iteration. If you can plan 1, 2, 3, 4 iterations ahead, you're in a good standing to actually develop something well. Also means you get something quicker, and also means your budget is less for each iteration, and you can control what gets spent and built at each time. Often we find that when we work with customers, they don't always know what they want until they see something, or they have a vision, but the users don't get any feedback until they actually see something. We can sit in workshops and focus groups and things like that, and people will give an opinion. But a very famous quote from Ford was, if you ask people what they want, they'll say a faster horse and cart, because they don't know what they can have. And that's where our job as technologists is to show them what they can have, or solution architects, is show them what they can have and what they can achieve. But the reality is, people don't really know until they see something. They'll ask for something, and then when they see it, they'll say, oh, it'd be nice if it did this, or nice if it did that. They need to see something to spark those thoughts. So again, taking that MVP approach, that minimal viable product approach, it means people can see something simple and basic early on, and then they can influence it with their ideas through the future iterations. So it's a good way of working. It's definitely something to focus on if you're building your own requirements for someone in your business to build or an external provider to build. Okay, so we've got our 4 requirements for our first iteration, and we're going to focus on that today. We're nearing 17, so get ready for it, and we should be automatically checking in any moment now. We should see this go green. 10. There we go. 9. It's gone green. If you view our active check-ins, we can see we have an active check-in here. And then as we carry on, we should see us automatically check out. Flip back to the next screen in a moment. Distance 9. 10, so distance is 10 again, and that's automatically checked us out. We're not green anymore. If you view our check-ins, then we can see that we have a checkout time as well as our check-in time. That's worked fantastic. Now that we've got our requirements, we can start to think about the design. The design is all about how we're going to build this thing. Okay, the requirements were the what are we going to build. The design is how are we going to build it. So when we look at the design, we need to weigh up a number of options. Okay, so now we can start to think about what technology is most appropriate. So we can decide, okay, we want an application interface. Right, so we've got a number of different options here. We can build a web app that sits in our intranet. We could build a Teams tab or plugin for this, or we could build native apps for iPhone and Android. We could use a Power Apps platform. We could use Microsoft Flash. Well, we can't because it's discontinued, so we'll knock that one off. So what we want to do is we want to lay all the different options down on the table. The reality of the situation now is that you might be forced down a particular path. Your business might be a Google house or an Amazon Web Services house, or you might be a Microsoft house. So we're going to take the view of a Microsoft house here because, hey, that's why you're here today. We're talking about Microsoft products. So the decision could be preordained. We know that we're going to use the Power Platform to build this. We know we're going to use Power Apps to deliver it. But we still need to consider the other options and decide why they may or may not be appropriate. So we could build a web application for it. So that could sit on the phone, but the user needs to bring up the browser. They need to go to the URL. If they see something else, they can click away. It just doesn't quite feel right based on experience of how to implement this kind of application. Teams, tabs, we could, but then Teams, we want to move around in Microsoft Teams a bit and not necessarily stay on the tab for the application to work while we're in the car or walking around. So I don't think that's going to work here. We could definitely build native applications for iPhone and Android. That would absolutely work, but we don't really want to deploy native apps. We don't have an app store in-house to make it easy to distribute them. We don't want to build two applications, one for iDevices and one for Android devices. We could use some cross-device technologies, maybe cross-platform technologies as an option. But we don't really have the skills in-house to do that. So I don't think native apps is going to work. So it kind of does bring us back nicely to Power Apps. Maybe we've got some other Power Apps in the business, or it's cross-platform, so we can support iPhones and Android devices. It can be used on tablets. We can embed it in a Teams tablet. We can embed it in a web page or on the intranet if we wanted to. And we're a Microsoft house. So Power Apps does feel like a good technology for delivering this. We can also do the location analysis. We can track where a user is on using the Power Apps service. We have a distribution mechanism for it because everyone's logging in with their Office 365 account. So on the balance of everything, we can discount the other technologies, and I think we can focus on Power Apps as an implementation. So as far as the app interface is concerned, I think we can make a good design decision to use Power Apps. The next thing we can think about is how we do some processing. So we have a processing layer where we need to check users in and out. So there's a number of different options we can consider here as well. So an obvious choice is to use Power Automate, which used to be called Microsoft Flow, or we could use its big brother, Logic Apps, or we could use Azure Functions, or some other kind of big data message queuing services in Azure. We could use AWS as well if we wanted to. We could use Nintex or other workflow providers. There's a whole set of technologies, again, that we can use. Now, maybe we don't have any third-party workflow tools in-house. We don't use Amazon or Google, or if this, then that. So they're not part of the technology stack we want to support, so we can discount them. So that leaves us in the Microsoft and Azure domain. So realistically, the only ones that tie into Power Apps neatly might be Logic Apps or might be Power Automate. Logic Apps, not really easy. I don't know if it's even possible to integrate Power Apps. So that kind of leads us back into Power Automate. Now, Power Automate is not designed to be a service level workflow engine. It's designed to be a user-focused workflow engine. So I want to do some automations for me. Okay, I want to automate responses to emails, or I want to automate responses to RSS feeds, things like that. So it's really designed to be user-centric for personal productivity. However, because it integrates nicely with things like Power Apps more than Logic Apps do, and Logic Apps is a bit more big brother and developer-y, then we can use Power Automate for a service level activity. A few caveats that we want to consider here is we probably want to run this under a service count. If our designer or developer is going to build it, then it's going to be very much tied to their account. So we want to be careful that if they leave the business, we don't lose access to that flow. So we might want to have a service account in the business that we can use to have that flow run. In that case, the flow is not tied to any individual user, which means it's got longevity of life. So I think that feels like a good one. And it's tightly integrated into Power Apps. We can easily call flows from Power Apps. So it seems like the logical solution to go with. If we need to move to other technologies in the future, we can do that. I have used Logic Apps and I have used Azure Functions. Now, what I've done there is I've had to have a flow, a Power Automate flow that goes and calls the Logic App or the Azure Function, because that's the only place we can do the HTTP calls from. So sometimes we might need the flow involved for that, but to call some big brother technology to do it beyond there. But for now, we're just going to stick with Microsoft Flow. We could actually write to a data source directly from Power Apps. We could use the patch command, and I'll talk about that a little bit later on as an option. But in this, I think we want to have some potential processing involved there rather than just writing to a list. In the future, one of my stretch goals might be I want to do some approvals or notifications. Maybe we want to send a facilities email that someone's arrived on site or something like that. So using a flow really does help us with that. So rather than just using a patch command to write directly to a data source, I want to do some intermediary processing. Therefore, Power Automate feels like the right technology for us to go with. So we've considered all the options and we've narrowed down to a technology that we want to use, and we can give reasons and justifications for that. And they should be documented down in your design document as well, or your high-level solution architecture document. Really, that should be as to why you made a choice of what technologies to use. So that's going to sort out our processing layer. The next thing we need to think about is where are we actually going to store our data? This one's a lot more flexible, because the Power App doesn't care where the data is, because the Power App isn't going to write directly to the data source. The flow is. So we can make a decision now based on our MVP approach, our minimal viable product, and we can change that out in the future. So if we want to change the data source in the future, we can. So it doesn't really matter too much. If we make the wrong choice, it's easily changeable. So we have a number of different options. We could store data in Dataverse if we want to use it elsewhere. We could store it in an Excel spreadsheet. Don't. We could store it in a SharePoint list. We could store it in SQL servers or Azure tables or Azure blob storage. There's a whole range of different places we can store this data. And we can really think about the cost of data storage, so the monetary cost. SQL Server can get expensive quick if you have a lot of data. Azure table storage is quite cheap and very flexible. We could store stuff there. But then it comes at a complexity of kind of back-end administration and users going in and looking at the data, building reports, things like that. It's a little bit more locked away. Locked away can be good if we don't want users to see that data directly. Then putting it into Azure Table Storage could be good. We don't really care too much about that. So I think what we're going to do is we're probably going to use some SharePoint lists for this. It's a nice, easy technology. We can store 30 million items in a SharePoint list. That's more than enough for the users we're going to be having on this application. Data administrators can go into the back end of the SharePoint list. They can create views on it. They can generate reports on it. And they can update and change the details as they need to. So it feels like a good solution there. But like I say, the nice thing is we know we're not constrained. In the future, we might be able to change that and use a different data store if we need to. And it won't actually affect the Power App. It just affects the flows that sit in the middle. So I think we've got a nice approach on the technologies we want to use. We're going to use Power Apps for the application. We're going to use Power Automate for the processing layer. And we're going to use SharePoint lists for the background data storage. So if we're coming on to SharePoint lists, there's a couple of considerations we could use. We could use Microsoft lists. All Microsoft lists are SharePoint lists. They're just stored in a location. So if I create lists, they're stored in my OneDrive, or I could create some shared lists. Now, I don't want to store them in my OneDrive. We've kind of mentioned before about not locking it to a particular user, so I don't really want to put them in Microsoft lists. Also, for my demo, when I was building it, I built it in a new developer tenant, so Microsoft lists wasn't set up and configured in time, and I couldn't be bothered to wait, so I didn't want to go that route. So actually, what I think is the best option here is to create a specific SharePoint site, as in site collection, create a specific SharePoint site for this application called site Checkins, and then we'll go and store our lists in there. So we've got an application area. We can also use that to grow it in the future. We could put a web interface onto it for people to look at the same data that way as well. And we have a nice way. We can administer it easy. Users can go in and maintain the data on the SharePoint site. Dead easy. So I think creating a SharePoint site for it is going to be the way to go. And then creating the list and libraries there. So I think that works quite well for us. So I'm not going to go any deeper into the design part. However, in reality, what I would do is I would actually be creating a document for this. So the document will go through the design. I would build up wireframes of the application. So what I think they should look like, and I can use that to go back to the business and check that's what their expectation is. So the design should have our application wireframes in there. So we can dry run through the application, say where the buttons are going to go, what the interaction is. Okay, we can do that visually to get some feedback. So that's what I would be putting into the document. I'll then also be looking at the data. What data do we need to store to make this application work? So we're going to need a list of site locations. Well, what do we need for a site location for it to work? Remember, we're going on an MVP. We don't want to overblow it with all the information we can. Basically, we need a site location name. We need a longitude. We need a latitude. That's probably all we need, I think. Yeah, that's all we need for a site location, those three things. So in our design document, we can say what they are. How does that work? What SharePoint field format is a longitude and latitude? Well, we know it needs to be a number field with 5 decimal places. We could go 6 decimal places. I don't think we need that level of accuracy. And I think SharePoint only lets us go to 5 decimal places anyway, so that's plenty. So we can articulate those decisions in the design document. Why 5 decimal places and not 6 decimal places? Okay, so the next thing we need to do is maintain a list of user check-ins. So once a user is automatically checked into a site, then we can actually say, what information do we need to record there? Well, we need the person who's being checked in. We need the site location, so either the name or the ID of the site location list item, the time they checked in, and the time they checked out. That's basically all we need to manage who's checked in or not. So anybody with a check-in time but no check-out time, we know they're currently on site. Anyone with a checked-in time and a checked-out time, then they've been on site and they've left. Okay, so that's good for reporting to know where people are, but it's not essential to have anything else beyond that. There's lots of things we could store and we might store in the future, but for an MVP approach, that's it. That's all we need. So that's all we're going to build today. The next thing we need to think about is our processing layer. So when we are checking users in and checking users out, what does that need to do? So we know we need to receive some information, the person, the location that they're checking into or out of, and we need to then decide what that process entails. Do we just write an entry straight to the SharePoint list saying this user's checked in and this user's checked out? Or do we need to do something else as part of it? Do we need to approve a check-in? Do we need to get someone to click and approve or reject on the check-in? Do we need to just send an email to a facilities manager or a health and safety manager to say somebody's on site now? What do we need to do? So one of the nice reasons of using Flow is it means that we can build this process up long term. But for now, for the MVP, what's the minimum it needs to do? Well, we need to get the information of who the user is and where they're checking into or out of, and we need to write that to a SharePoint list. That's it. That's all it needs to do. So that's all we're going to build today. So now I've built my design of the application. I have a pretty good idea of what it is that I'm going to be building for my customer. So what I can do now, I can present that design back to the customer and say, this is how I'm going to build your application. And this is how we're going to tick off each of your requirement points. By doing this, it will tick off that requirement. By doing this, it will tick off that requirement. By doing this, that requirement and that requirement. Is this what you are expecting? The business user can look at it, they can visualize it because they've got wireframes in there, and they can decide if what's being proposed matches what they have asked for. So we have a nice communication piece and a nice project gateway here that we can decide whether we should continue or not. If I, as an implementer, with that hat on, if I've misunderstood what someone's asking for, this is a good opportunity to identify it before we get too far down the line of building the application. It's a lot harder to unpick technology than it is to unpick a design document. Okay, so that's a really important bit now, to have a shared understanding. And you really want to have someone in the business, like an SME, a subject matter expert, who's able to talk technology, but also talk business. Because more often than not, developers and business users don't talk the same language, and it can be very confusing. Developers and implementers can really overcomplicate conversations, and business users are a bit scared of it. So they just kind of say, yeah, okay, don't understand it, but yeah, okay, I'll trust you. Then the implementer goes off, they build it, come back, they see it, and they're like, that's not what I asked for. So you really need someone who can talk those both languages. And that's where an SME or a subject matter expert can really help out. They can bridge that gap between business and technology. And that's quite an important skill to embrace and to have access to. So the other thing we can do, at the point of me building some design, so I've got that hat back on, I'm building my design and my technological approach. What I can do now, based on my experience, I can start to understand what some of the risks are. because I've got experience, because I've built things before and I've played around with it, I've tried it, I've got a good idea of what might be difficult. And sometimes things that don't seem very complicated could be quite difficult to implement. And business users don't always understand this. They might just ask for that, I just want one little button that searches the internet. It's not that difficult, it's just a button. But in reality, what goes behind that button working can be incredibly complicated. So the business users need to trust the technologists that if they say something's going to be difficult, it probably will be. And if you push them down a line to go ahead and do it, you're introducing a significant amount of risk. So alongside the design document, it's important for the implementer and the technologist to build a risk register. So we need to identify what we think might be quite hard. Now, based on my experience, I think most of this project is going to be quite straightforward. I think most of it should be able to follow the happy path quite comfortably. But one thing I'm unsure about is, how do you calculate the distance between 2 points? So I've got a geographic point of where the user's running the application, and I've got a geographic point of my site location. And how do I calculate, using longitude and latitude, how far apart they are? That could be quite a difficult mathematical problem to solve. So I'm going to raise that as a risk. It might be difficult to accurately estimate where we're going to be. What if there's no cell coverage? What if there's no Wi-Fi for someone's mobile to connect to? That could be a problem. What if a user has more than 30 million check-ins or what if all of our users have more than 30 million check-ins and we're going to run out of the scope of what a SharePoint list can manage? So technology should be thinking about all these edge cases and all these things that could go wrong on a project based on that experience. Put all that in a risk register. We say, this is what I think could be a risk. And the risk could be, I don't get a response from the business to do the testing on time. That could delay your timeframes and your delivery and hence your costs. So all these things should be raised in a risk register at that point based on the experience of the person doing the implementation. And that's very powerful because you are covering your own backside when they complain that something's not being done right. And the business also understands that if they're saying something might be difficult, it might actually be difficult and they should pay attention to that. So it's important to identify the potential risks. And my approach to running a project is I like to tackle the hard things first. I like to front load the effort, get the hard stuff out of the way, because if you can't solve a hard problem, you might need to change everything else. It might be we change the technology we use completely. So do the hard things first, and then have the easier things left towards the end. So then you can identify if those risks are going to come through or not. And with the risk, you also need to have a mitigation plan as well. If that risk happens, then how are you going to back out of it? How are you going to mitigate that risk and how are you going to work around it and what are your options? So we've spent an awful lot of time before we've even started building anything. Most people, when they want to build an app, they'll just get straight into Power Apps and they'll just start building it and they'll figure out as they go along. But you really want to spend a large proportion of time before even coding anything, understanding what the project's all about. What do people want? How are you going to build it? What's the risk to delivery? And how long do you think it's going to take and how much do you think it's going to cost? These are important things to understand before you build anything. And unfortunately, when we start pricing up projects for customers, they don't like this big lot of consultancy work beforehand because they just want to focus on developer days. How long is it going to take to implement? But by getting this bit right first, that bit should happen so much easier. So it's really important to put the focus on those elements. So now we've got our requirements, we've got our design, we've got our potential risks, and I think we're about ready to start building the application. Right, so the first thing we need to do is to create our application site. So we'll just call this site Checkins. Make sure it's a private site, so only our app credential can write to the list, and we don't want to add any members to it. Once we have our site, then we can go into site content and we can start to create some lists. So the first list we want is our list of site locations. This is going to satisfy our first requirement. And in this list, we want to add some fields. So we have a title already in our SharePoint list, and we want to add some fields for longitude and latitude. So as we said, they're going to be a number field, and we're going to set it to have 5 decimal places. Okay, so the next thing we want to do now is we actually want to enter some locations. Now, just for simplicity, I'm going to find local Tesco shops near me. That's easy. I've got the geo coordinates, so if I pick up the address of it in Google Maps, then you can see you actually get the longitude and latitude from the URL. So I can use this to get a series of stores near me and enter them in. So I've got a list of my locations. This could be my construction sites or client sites, anything like that, anything that we want to track. But we have a list of locations with latitude and longitude. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're going to create a basic Power App. So I'm going to choose to create it from a SharePoint source. And by creating it from a SharePoint source, it's going to build a basic application for me. So to do this, I just need to get the URL of the SharePoint site that my data is on, and I can choose the list, and it'll go ahead and build that for me. So when you would build an app from directly from a list, it's going to build me a gallery scene, a screen, and then it's going to have a detail scene for each item and an edit screen. So that's a really nice starting place. It gives us things like refresh and search and sort as well, which is very useful. But it's a really solid starting point. So now what I want to do is I need to simulate my my location, because I'm not going to be walking around as I'm building it. I want to simulate the location that I'm at. So I'm going to simulate, I'm going to use the browser tools, the developer tools. We can go to the sensors option, and I can actually create some locations. So I'm going to create some browser locations near the Tesco shops that I want to work with, and then I can actually change my browser location to pretend I'm somewhere that I'm not. Okay, so I'll create a few. I'll create one near the Ramsbottom Tesco store, one near the Brandlesholme Tesco store, and then so on and so on. So we can create these near the locations, and then we'll create a couple not near the locations as well, so we can simulate not being close to an area. This is a really useful thing if you're doing anything with geolocation, knowing that you can actually spoof your location in the browser. It's a really useful tool to have available, and we'll be using this throughout. Then at the very end, I would take my app out on the road, drive around, and see if I'm close to any of my locations or not. Okay. So now we've got that in, so our gallery is set. So I can update the UI a little bit, so we can show the longitude and the latitude. I'm going to create a little footer on the UI as well. This is going to hold my current location. So from here, I can make the text white, and then I can actually use the Power Apps option of location.latitude and location.longitude, and that's going to give me my longitude and my latitude. Now in the browser, I'll have to accept location tracking, and on my phone, give it permission to track my location. Okay, so that's my current location now. To save the app, give it a name. Good. So what we can do now, if I change my location, you'll see my my current location changing in the blue bar at the bottom. That seems to work really well. So what I want to do now is be able to work out my current distance from my locations. So how far am I from each of these stores? That's going to be the hard thing. So this is something I think could be quite complicated. And we'll just tidy up the UI a little bit, just make it look a bit neater. I'm not going to spend too long on this. Put a little comma in the middle. Okay. Making it look pretty is everything. Let's face it, all your customers ever really want is something to look pretty. Doesn't matter if it works or not. So you'll notice as well, as I go on, I like to rename my controls as I go. I hate it when people don't rename controls, because when you come back in 6 months' time, you have no idea what anything does. So please, for the love of God, please do name your controls accordingly as you go. Don't go back and think you'll fix it up later. Do it as you go. Okay, so in this control here, I'm going to use this to track the distance to the location. So this will be my current distance from each location, and that'll update. There we go. So put a title in, then we'll put a label in that's actually going to show the distance going forward. So now what we need to do is we actually need to work out what the distance is. Now this is something that could be quite difficult. I imagine it's going to be quite a bit of math involved. So the only thing we can do, go onto Bingle and try and find an equation that we can use. So let's do a little search for this. And oh, here we go. How to find the distance between two longitudes and latitudes. And this gives us some complex math. This looks definitely looks like what we're after. And there's something called the Haversine formula. So apparently this gives us the distance between 2 points. And very helpfully, this seems to give us an Excel calculation. Well, that could be nice. So the question is, does Power Apps support the methods for ACOS, sine, and cos? It possibly could. It's got quite a good set of maths. So let's go and put some comments in here, because when I come back to this again in 6 months' time or a year's time, I'm going to have no idea what this is all about. So if we can actually put in some comments as we go, then that's really useful. So we'll have a reference to the formula, and luckily Power Apps does actually have an ACOS formula and a sine formula, and obviously it's going to have the cos formula. So what we can do, we can just plug our values in. So we'll just take the location, the latitude and the longitude from our text boxes in our gallery, and then we can just build up the formula accordingly. So location.latitude, remember, that's our current location, and the location latitude.text and location longitude.text. That's the actual site location. Now, it's not great to actually use the location, the text values from there. We're actually better to use a number item. So in a moment, we'll go and change it to show the numeric value from the actual item, so from the SharePoint list item. And that'll be a number, so that will obviously work better rather than having to convert it to a number. So we'll just go through, build up the formula. So here we go. So we can see now, tied it up a bit, we can see actually these are a little bit far out. There you go. So this is where we changed it to the item.latitude and item.longitude. So it's actually numerical value. Now we did notice that actually those items are quite far away. They were quite big numbers. So what I realized was that my longitude and my latitudes were the wrong way around in my SharePoint list. So I've actually gone ahead and updated that, and behind the scenes, as you can see, I now have better distances. So now, one thing I never figured out is what unit the Haversine formula returns. It doesn't seem to be meters. It doesn't seem to be kilometers. So I actually have no idea. I can't figure it out, and I never did figure it out. Now, what I want to do is here, I'm just going to create a collection of my location so that I can add the distancing. So I want to sort my gallery by the distance, but distance doesn't exist in my data source. So what I can do in my my app on start is I can actually create a Power App collection of my data source and add the distance formula as an extra column to my data source. And then what I can do now, I can just remove the formula out of the text box, and I can actually just reference the distance column that I added into a collection. Collections are really useful ways of working with content within the app and not from directly from the data source. So that means later on I'll be able to do a sort by the location to put the highest item at the front. And here is where we do a sort by columns. My locations, which is the collection name, and we want to sort by the distance column, and we want to have ascending. So it's the closest location to us at the start. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to add a timer, because the collection doesn't update automatically. So if we add a timer in, then I can actually do a clear collect, so I can empty out the collection and then recreate it, and that'll update it with the new distance or the current distance. Okay, so we'll just set it for 6 seconds and see how we go on. We might want to make that shorter. I think in the end I set this to about 1 second, but every 6 seconds it's going to update the collection, which updates the gallery, and that moves the closest item to the top. So as we virtually change our location, we can see that updated. So that's really useful. It's a good thing to have in place. Now what we want to do is I just want to highlight an item, a location that we're checked in at. So I've decided if we're less than 10 units, again, remember I have no idea what the units are here. If we're 10 units away from a particular location, then we can assume that we are at that location and we are checked in. So we'll just set a coloured rectangle in the background of our gallery cards, and we'll say if this item dot distance is less than 10, then make it a nice light coral colour. Otherwise, make it white. Oh, white coral is disgusting, so let's go for a light green instead. Yeah, that's better. There we have it. So now if we change our location, we can see it updates. Or you have to be in full screen mode for it to update the location. So if we move away from it and move to it, we can see it highlights green if our closest location is less than 10 units away. So that works really, really nicely. So once we know that we're within the vicinity of a location, what we want to do is we actually want to automatically check the user in. That was our second requirement. So we need a SharePoint list for checked in users. So back to our SharePoint site, create the list, and we'll create some fields. So we always have a title. We want a person, so we want to know who is at that location. That's going to be required, of course. We also want to know the location that a user's at. So we're going to put in a number. This is going to be the list item ID of the location from the other list. And we can use it as a reference and a lookup. So we'll put the number in here. Okay, so we have the date, the location, and then we have the date and time the user checks in to the location, and a date and time that the user checks out of the location. There we go, so that's our data source sorted out. So now we've got our data source. If we go back to Power Apps, we can add a new data source to our Power App, and if we go back to our list, we can choose the new list, checked in users, and we now have access to this within our Power App. So again, I like the idea of using collections. It worked well for us before. So if we go back to the app on start, we'll just create a collection again for the check-ins. And we'll add an extra column to the SharePoint field called active. And we have a filter there to just bring in just the check-ins that are me. Yeah, so where the person.email is my Power Apps user's email. So what we're going to do now is build a flow. Okay, so now we can actually build the flow. So we need to get some input from the Power App. So we want to receive the user's email and the location that they want to check in as a number and the date and time that they are checking in. And that's all the information we need. Again, give your Power App a nice name. I like to use the application name and then the method. And the first thing I'm going to do, I'm just going to dump out the information that gets sent through. So we can just do a test run of the flow from the Power App just to make sure it's calling it properly. And we'll just write out the values that we're trying to pass through, the email, the location, and the check-in date time. And then we'll send a response back to Power Apps because Power Apps can receive a response back. In this case, I'm just going to send success to say it worked. and then the Power App knows it can carry on. So we could return some values if we wanted to, and do that, use those in Power Apps. And then in my timer, I'm just going to go in, and at the end, I want to say, so what I'm going to do here, I'm just going to sort my collection by distance. And that means that the first item in my collection is always going to be the closest location to me. So then I just know if the first item in the list is less than 10, I want to check the user into that location. To make it easy, I can just add a button to my display form, and I can use this to mock up how I call my flow. It's dead easy. You do just go to Action Flow, pick the flow you want, and it tells you how to send the information through. So I want to send the user email, the first ID of my locations, so the location that I am at, and then I call the method now to send the current time through. And we can go and look at our compose, and we can see that's all coming through successfully. Now, I had an issue when I actually ran it to simulate it. What we're doing here is we're actually going to go and we're going to add the item to SharePoint. So we're happy that runs okay. And now we just want to add the item to SharePoint. So we choose the create item action, choose the site address. We want to get the user's details. So from the user's email that gets passed through, we need to get their claims ID so we can get the display name from the Office 365 users action. So we can access their friendly display name for the title. And we can also get the claims, their logon details essentially to pass into the person field in SharePoint. And we also want to get the friendly name of the site location we're logging into. So we'll do another get item from the locations list, pass in the ID of the location, that will get us the friendly name of it. So we can put that into the title of the check-in. So we know that user checked into that location at that time. So from the Office 365 users, we can get the user principal name and the check-in time. Okay, so what we do, if we click the check-in button and go, we can see it's run successfully. That all looks okay. We've created some SharePoint list items apparently. And there we can see we've checked in. Now this actually ran on the 4th of January, not April the 1st. So to get around this, I've actually gone and changed the call to the flow. Instead of using now, then I've actually concatenated the year, month, day, hour, minute, and second. So this is going to be a UTC formatted date, and it just clears up any confusion over which part of it is a month and which part of it is a day. So if we run that again, then we can see it's run successfully. We've got a correct date coming through. It's created a list item, and we can see now the checked in time is a few seconds ago. So it was on the 4th of January, and we can see that's run okay. So all I'm going to do now is on my timer on end, I'm going to say if the first item in my locations list, if the distance is less than 10, then go and run the flow. Now, I've changed my timer to update every second. So when I get near a location, I'm going to find it's going to call my flow every second and give me lots of check-ins. And that's not what I want, because once I'm at the location, I don't want to check in again. It basically needs to sit there and wait for me to move away from my location. So we can just fix that up. We can use a variable in here called var checked in. So if it checks me in, then I can set checked in as true. And then I can update my condition for running my flow to say if the distance is less than 10 units and I'm not already checked in somewhere, then run the check-in flow. Okay, so the next time I run it, I'll already be checked in and it won't check me in again. So you can see I'm only getting one check-in now, and that's great. If I move away from it, so just for temporarily, I'm going to have another timer in here because once I'm checked in, I'm never going to be checked out. So I'm just going to run a timer and say, if I've been there for an hour, then just set the variable to say that I'm not checked in anymore. So set variable checked in false. Okay, so the next time it runs, it'll say, oh, you're not checked in anywhere, so let's do your check-in. Now, we'll take that out later on and when we do the checkout flow. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're going to do the checkout flow. And it's going to be exactly the same. So we'll take a call from Power Apps. And all we need to do is pass the user, because we're just going to say if the user moves away from a location, just check them out of everywhere. So we can just find out, do a query where the person's email is equal to my email and the checked out time is null. So if that date is, if the checked out is not populated, then mark it as checked out. So that should only ever really be one, but if there is more than one, it'll also check us out of everywhere. Nice little catch all that. So we have to put the title in, have to put the location in each time, and then we can just set the checked out time to now. So that will just update the check-in list item with the checked out time. And then again, just do a little response to Power Apps. So again, add a little button to the form so we can just simulate the checkout, so we can hard code the checkout method. It's just nice and easy to run and test this way, and then we can plug it in. So we just pass the user email over, check the run, we can see that's worked, and if we refresh the page, should work. There you go. So we can see it's actually run now. It looks like it's updated one item. Check the browser, and there we can see it's done our checkout. So we can take that flow call and we can add it to the end of our timer. So our timer on end, again, we can say if the first item in our collection is now more than 10 units and the user is currently checked in, then we want to do a checkout. So we can just call that flow. And we obviously need to update our variable as well now to say that we're not currently checked in anywhere. So when we get close to another location, it will do the check-in again. And we can now delete our temporary timer to do the checkout. So we can see here, we go to Ramsbottom, we checked in. We've only got one check-in as we want. We then move away from Ramsbottom and now not anywhere. And we can see the flow runs and we have a checked out time as well. We can just try that a few times. So Brandleshome, yep, we're checked in. Move away. And we're checked out. We can just test that a few times. We can just as well check that we can only check into one place at a time, just kind of try and trick it, but because we're already checked in, it won't run the check-in again. So we should always do a checkout first. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're going to take the app out on the road and just give you a little demonstration of how it works. So as we're recording our location, I'm just going to drive around my local area and we're going to see, as we get closer to some Tesco stores, we should see ourselves automatically check in, and then when we drive away from them, automatically check out. So we're going to head this way down to the first store and we should be there in just a couple of minutes. Okay, so we're just coming up on our first location and we can see the number of degrees for the Bury Tossington Express coming down. So as we get closer to that location, we should see us automatically check in. Okay, so we're now narrowing in on our first location. We can see the numbers coming down as we're getting closer and closer. And hopefully when the top number gets to 10, then we'll see an automatic check-in. Just to confirm, we have no current check-ins at the moment, so they're not active anywhere. Down to 37, 36. We're nearing 17, so get ready for it, and we should be automatically checking in any moment now. We should see this go green. 10. There we go, 9. It's gone green. If we view our active check-ins, we can see we have an active check-in here. And then as we carry on, we should see us automatically check out. Flip back to the next screen in a moment. 10, so distance is 10 again, and that's automatically checked us out. We're not green anymore. If you view our check-ins, then we can see that we have a checkout time as well as our check-in time. That's worked fantastic. So now we can go on to our second location. And we should see the display change from Tottington to Brandlesholme. That's the next one we're going to drive past. So now we're narrowing in on our second location. It's got some police activity here. Well done, Bobby. Okay, so coming up on our second location, we're about to hit 10, and there we are. It's gone green. View our check-ins, we can see an active check-in, so our flow has run successfully, and we are now 3, 2, and we're coming up on the Tesco right here. So that has worked within our 10 degrees. It's gone and checked us in, and there we are. So as we carry on driving away, I think the GPS points are slightly off, but that doesn't matter. Now we've gone over 10 again, and we can view our check-ins, and we see we have an automatic checkout as well. So everything appears to be working just as we expect. And now we're going back to our final location for one last test. So we're coming up on our final location now. So we're getting closer into the location now. We're going to see the numbers start to drop, and hopefully we'll get a final automated check-in just to show we're not cheating. We have our previous check-ins here. Up 24, 23. Coming into our final location shortly. I think my GPS point's slightly off because it's a little bit further away than this. Traffic. Woo! Someone's not happy. Right, we're getting closer. Ironically, we're following a Tesco delivery van. And there we go, so we're within 10. It's actually just behind these buildings on the side, so we are within the vicinity, so we can take that as a success. Just drive around, just check we've got a check-in. So when that refreshes, we should have a local check-in. Just have another look. Check-ins. There we go, so we have a check-in on our local store, which is right here. So we come up, and our Tesco store is right there, and we're right on the money. So I think we can take that as a success, and as we drive away, we will see the automatic checkout work as expected. Now I'm actually going to park here and spend some time in this Tesco because I want to go get some lunch. So I think we can consider that a success. And there, we've actually satisfied all of our requirements. So there's a very quick run through on how to actually implement the application. But because we spent so much time up front designing how we're going to actually build it and what it is we're going to build, then the build was actually quite straightforward. So I really hope you enjoyed that. Hopefully it's give you a flavour of the types of things you can build in Power Apps and some of the capabilities using geotagging, but also give you an overview on how to actually run your projects in the first place. Thank you very much for spending some time with me today, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you and goodbye.